Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Poramapa Poonpakdee will defend the academic thesis, Making Sense of Uncertainty in Macroeconomic Models. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Prorector, Corona members, supervisors, family, friends, and colleagues who are joining us today and from online. Welcome to my PhD defense. My thesis title is Making Sense of Uncertainty in Macroeconomic Model. In this research, I explore how people respond to uncertainty, and I use that knowledge to improve macroeconomic models. In the next 15 minutes, I will talk you through my 5-year learning of the PhD, and I hope that I can convince you that I have successfully contributed to the economics field. Let's start with the problem. In the past decade, we have learned that macroeconomic models underperformed during the crisis. For example, in 2008 global financial crisis, this bar chart shows the forecast error of GDP growth at that time. The red bars are from different macroeconomic models, and the black bar are from professional forecasters. The lower the bar means the prediction is better. And as you can see, the macroeconomic models has higher forecast errors than the professional forecaster. The professional forecaster, they are people like us, and they have a job to do economic forecast, and they are not bounded by mathematical equations. They can use different type of information to do the forecast. So this picture shows that there are room to improve for macroeconomic model. Why macro model underperformed during the crisis? One of the main reasons is uncertainty. This graph shows you that in 2008 and 2009, uncertainty was spiked at that time. And in fact, it was the highest uncertainty since 1985. Let me explain what is uncertainty. Uncertainty simply means when you don't know something. In my thesis, I talk about uncertainty in 2 dimensions. The first dimension is macroeconomic uncertainty or macro uncertainty. It affects everyone, and it can be caused by the big events like Brexit or COVID. The second one is subjective uncertainty. Subjective uncertainty is from individual perspective. What makes me uncertain might be different from what makes you uncertain. In the macro models, macro uncertainty affects people's expectations, and the expectations gonna affect people's decisions. And this change in decisions will affect the whole economy. In my thesis, I focused on the first link, the link between macro uncertainty and expectations. In chapter 2, I studied the effect of macro uncertainty on people's expectation. I used a data set to study this. In this chapter, I asked 2 questions. The first question is, how does macro uncertainty change people's beliefs? And the second question is, how does macro uncertainty change individual subjective uncertainty? To study this, I used 4 survey data sets. 2 are from professional forecaster, another 2 are from the household. It is essential to include both surveys. The professional forecasters are widely used to study the expectations, so they serve as the benchmark. The household, they are actual player in the economy, so the expectation is as important or even more important than the professional forecaster. The first question, how does macro uncertainty change individual belief? I expected that people will become more pessimistic. This is the probability distribution graph. If the means of the graph move to the left, the people will become more pessimistic. What I found is that both professional forecaster and the household tends to become more pessimistic. And it is the first stylized fact. The second question, how does macro uncertainty change individual subjective uncertainty? I expected that people will become more uncertain. If the distribution is wider, it means that people become more uncertain. And what I found is that professional forecaster tends to become more uncertain. However, the household is actually tends to become more certain. As you can see that the distribution is getting narrower. And this means that we can be certain in the time of high uncertainty period. And it is the new stylus fact that I discovered in chapter 2. Now in chapter 3, I will construct the macro model that can replicate the two stylus facts that I just presented before. In standard macro model, macro uncertainty is seen as risk. And by definition, risk is an increase in subjective uncertainty. And as you can see, this only accounts for some parts of the finding in chapter 2, so I sought out for another definition. In 1921, Knight has distinguished between risk and ambiguity. Ambiguity, according to his definition, is when we are uncertain about the probability distributions. And this means that if we are facing with ambiguity, we cannot come up with the probability distributions, like when we're facing risk, like in this picture. And in macro model, we see ambiguity as the multiple scenarios. Each scenario has its own probability distributions, and the agent has to design which scenario is more important for them and make a decision according to that. I integrated ambiguity as macro uncertainty into my model. Our model incorporates smooth ambiguity theory, and it allows for different levels of ambiguity aversion. And ambiguity aversion refers to the degree of discomfort with ambiguity. To illustrate our model, let me provide two examples. The left side is the person with the low ambiguity averse, and the right side is the person with high ambiguity averse. And imagine that you are one of the person in this picture. It might be easier to follow with me in the next following slides. Let's think that when you are facing with ambiguity, you will see the future in two scenarios. There could be recessions or there is no recession, like there will be normal growth. If macro uncertainty is high, the difference between the two scenarios is small. For example, in the normal growth scenario, you expect that you will be unemployed. You will be employed, sorry. In the recession scenario, you will expect that you will be unemployed. But when macro uncertainty is high, the difference between the two scenarios becomes larger. In this case, in the recessions, you may expect that you will become homeless. And being homeless is worse than being jobless. On the top of that, if you are high ambiguity averse, you really hate ambiguity, you will be likely to believe that the recession scenario is going to happen. So you will be more concerned about the recession scenario. This shows that the attitude toward ambiguity also shapes how you view the world, and it will affect how you make the decisions. Next, I will use the model simulations to show you that this mechanism can replicate the two stylized facts that I present in chapter 2. First stylized fact. So we found that people become more pessimistic when macro uncertainty increases. And this graph shows the scatter plot between beliefs about recession probability and macro uncertainty. As you can see, when macro uncertainty increases, the belief about recession probability also increases. It means that people become more pessimistic. And if you are a high ambiguity averse person, this individual will become even more pessimistic than the low ambiguity averse person. Let's look at the second stylized fact, that people can become more or less uncertain when macro uncertainty increases. This graph shows the scatter plot between individual subjective uncertainty and macro uncertainty. As you can see, when macro uncertainty increases, individual subjective uncertainty also increases. It means that people become more uncertain. In the case of high ambiguity aversions, we saw a non-monotonic relationship. When macro uncertainty is low, subjective uncertainty increases with macro uncertainty. When macro uncertainty is high, subjective uncertainty actually decreases. And even though macro uncertainty continues to rise. And here we have the case that people become more certain when macro uncertainty increases. Now I have shown you that our model can replicate two stylized facts. In chapter 4, I evaluated whether this model can predict economic growth accurately. To study this, I used a very simple model So this is the benchmark model without uncertainty. There are two agents. One is the household, another one is the firm. The household provide labor and capital to the firm, and the firm pay wages and interest rate to the household. Given this information, the household will consume, decide how much to consume, how much to invest, and the firm will also decide how much to produce. The firm's output will be the proxy for economic growth. I added one important key aspect. I assume that the household is exposed to macro uncertainty, and the household is behaved according to the mechanism that I explained in chapter 3. This will affect how the household make the expectation and will also affect their decisions. It will also indirectly affect the firm decisions, and thus it will affect the economic growth. And this is the result. First, I compare the model estimation of my model with the benchmark model. The dashed line is the dashed line here is the US output growth, and the black line is the estimation from the benchmark model, and the red line is the estimation from our model. And you can see that our model can match with the data better than the benchmark model. However, this might not be a fair comparison because benchmark model is overly simplified. Therefore, I would like to push the boundary forward. I will compare our model out of sample forecast with the professional forecaster. And this is the result. So now the black line is the prediction from professional forecasters, and the bar chart on the right side is the forecast errors. The black bar are the forecast error from professional forecaster, and the red bar is from the models. And if you look at the overall period, the forecast error of my model and the professional forecaster are comparable. When we look at the normal growth period, professional forecaster perform better than our model since they have lower forecast error. In the recession period, the most left bar, our model perform better than the professional forecaster because we have the lower forecast errors. And if you remember in the first slide that I showed you during the crisis, macro models tend to perform worse than the professional forecaster. This result shows that adding ambiguity into the model significantly improved the model performance in forecasting. However, what I learned in this 5 years is that there is no perfect model that can explain the economy. Therefore, the main contribution of this research is not only about the improve of the forecasting performance, it's also about the conceptual framework that I have introduced along the way. To conclude my presentation, I would like to highlight my research and its contribution to the economic literature. This started 100 years ago, when Knight defined what the difference between risk and ambiguity. 60 years later, Killian and Prescott, the Nobel Prize winner, created macro model that explained the medium-term dynamics of the economy. At that time, they have already incorporated the concept of risk into the macro model, and we have been using it since then. In chapter 2, I showed you that people do not always respond to uncertainty at risk, and therefore it might not be adequate to only focus on risk when we develop macro model. However, of course, I'm not the first one who recognized this. After the global financial crisis, we know that it became evident that the macro model needs to be revised. In 2014, Eluth and Schneider added ambiguity into the macro model. 6 years later, Altuk and the co-author has incorporated smooth ambiguity theory into the macro model. We also use smooth ambiguity in our model. And now, in 2023, in chapter 3 and 4, I proposed a new method to model ambiguity, and this makes our model become empirically observable, so we can estimate and do the forecasting with our model. I hope I have convinced you that I have contributed something to the economics field. Thank you very much. I would like to hand the floor back to Prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Mark Sanders, who was the chair of the assessment committee and who is professor of international economics at this university. The floor goes to Professor Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, dear Pawn, let me start by congratulating you on a thesis that contains interesting and important contributions to an important field, as you've just explained to us. And I also wanted to compliment you on the efforts to visualize the essence of your journey on the cover. It gives the work a nice personal touch, and it shows how involved and engaged you are in your work. Finally, let me compliment you on very clearly written chapters, each carefully explaining the steps taken to reach the conclusions presented. And I think that's the first and most important criterion by which we always must judge academic work. And the advantage of that is, of course, that it's not very hard to come up with questions and challenges. So let me do you the honor of also bringing some questions to the floor. Now, I know my colleagues here have prepared a set of interesting questions on all the chapters individually, so I'm going to skip right to, let's say, zooming out a bit and asking you about what it all means that you have presented us with. My question on the thesis as a whole is about the policy implications of your tentative results. You argue and convince the reader that ambiguity inversion affects behavior, and that this has negative consequences. And the mechanism is that ambiguity-averse people reduce their consumption in recessions more than the non-ambiguity-averse people, causing growth to decline more than it should have or need be. And the reason is that these ambiguity-aversion people, they see the gap between the worst and best case scenario increase or the worst case scenario deteriorate, and they adjust their consumption based on those scenarios, to which they attach an irrational high weight. So that calls for intervention, for policy, right? It makes intuitive sense. People who are scared and uncertain make irrational decisions, and they exaggerate their response even in light of their own preferences. So my question is really, what can we do to help these people? Because the uncertainty is going to stay, right? Energy transition, geopolitical unrest, war, climate disaster, pandemic, you name it. There's going to be shocks, there's going to be uncertainty. So we cannot reduce the uncertainty, but can we do something about the anxiety? Can we affect how ambiguity aversion feeds into behavior? So break that, let's say, negative cycle. And I was wondering specifically, because that is a personal, I guess, hobby horse of mine, how you feel about things like an unconditional universal basic income, or maybe a job or work guarantee system, honor of Johan here next to me, to try and break this dynamic between uncertainty that is going to be present and ambiguity through ambiguity aversion to behavior. I look forward to your answer.
Dear highly esteemed opponents, thank you very much for your kind words and your questions. It is very interesting. So let me start answering with the part about the policy implications to deal with people who have very high ambiguity aversions. So I think that in the research, the main contribution that I built is to distinguish between risk and ambiguity. And by knowing that risk is different from ambiguity and people respond to these two differently, it will help policymakers to communicate differently, first of all. And the second, it will help the policymaker to plan the actual policy differently. Let me start with the communications. The communication is that if you know that this uncertainty that we are facing now is ambiguity, it's not risk. So the communication could be trying to address different scenarios. For example, I think before the Brexit, Bank of England has addressed this question like, if you do Brexit, we will do this. So this is how addressing the different scenario. If there's a Brexit, we will react like this. So at that time, it's about the communication. It helped reduce the ambiguity. And once the Brexit really happens, the Bank of England, they have already planned in advance what they will do in this scenario, and they have right away reduced the interest rate. So I think that would help stabilize the economy more, and will also help the policymaker to plan the policy better. The second question is about universal income or the pensions. how is that help with these situations? It's not directly in my research, but I have the extended version of this, and there are some literature showing that individual instability has affect how they view the world. So if like you are very unstable on yourself, you will see the world unstable as well. So the personal instability affect how you do the forecast and the uncertainty about your forecast. So I think in this case, if people know that even though they are being unemployed or they're being jobless and they still have some security behind that will help reduce individual subjective uncertainty because they are more stable in their own life, and that therefore the income forecast or the utility forecast will be more stable. And yes, and therefore I think that when that being more stable, it will also, even though the world is very uncertain, the person who have under this regime will be more stable or will be more certain, not as uncertain as the world are. So I think that would be my answer.
So if I can briefly follow up?
Well, it should be a very brief question.
Well, very brief. So the answer is yes. You think this would help also at the macro level, because you say it reduces individual uncertainty, but that then translates to the macro level.
In my opinion, I think it wouldn't help with the macro level uncertainty, because uncertainty at the macro level, it's affected with some very unpredictable shocks, like corona crisis or like really big stuff, Brexit. So this kind of regime will not help reduce the macro uncertainty in that sense, but it will help people deal with macro uncertainty better.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued online by Dr. Damjan Pfeiffer, who was also a member of the assessment committee and who is the group manager and principal economist of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The floor goes to Dr. Pfeiffer.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidates, dear opponents, I would also like to congratulate you on your thesis. It is very nicely written and it addresses very relevant topic. But not just that, there are quite a few hidden contributions to the thesis, which goes to the adaptation of different solution techniques, definition of steady states, which are sometimes borrowed from within the Hank literature, but still very innovative. The estimated model improves the forecasting performance of the model, especially in the recessions, as you have shown us. But before I ask you about the transmission mechanism, before I ask you about the estimation part, I would like to ask you about the transmission mechanism of uncertainty. And you mentioned three potential channels in your paper: the spread between the expected utilities between the two scenarios, the scaling factor, and the belief distortion. I would like you, if you can comment on relative importance of these three different channels in your estimated model. So which channels are more important in your estimated model? And then regarding the estimation, which is really nice and really frontier, I was wondering what are the limitations of your approach? And you know, for example, the current paper, you fit the GDP growth series, but can you readily extend your estimation approach to a slightly larger model where you will fit more variables? And is a particle filtering also an alternative estimation approach that one could consider in this case? Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and questions. The signal wasn't good in the first place. Could you repeat your first question, the three channels that you were asking about?
So in the first part, I was asking about the transmission of uncertainty, and your thesis mentions three potential channels through which, you know, the uncertainty transmits to the macroeconomic world. And the first part is the spread between expected utilities between the two scenarios. Then there is a scaling factor, and there is a belief distortion part, as you explained in your last chapter. And I was wondering if you can comment on the relative importance of these three channels.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I would like to first address the first questions about mechanism and the channels. So I think it's in this channel play different role in different times. So in the low uncertainty period, so in the low ambiguity period, the spread will not play much role, but that also will affect that we will have no much belief distortion, and the scaling effect doesn't matter as well. So the three channel about uncertainty have very small role when uncertainty is low. But when uncertainty is high, I would say medium high, not very high. In the medium high uncertainty period, the spread or between the two scenarios would play the role much, because at that time people will start to realizing that we can have two scenarios and we have to decide on which scenario you want to work. And at that point, being high or low ambiguity averse doesn't matter to you that much, because you only exposed to the small amount of uncertainty or ambiguity. And once the uncertainty is very high, especially in the crisis that I highlight, but once that uncertainty is very high, in this case, I think the belief distortion is going to play more role, because now it's going to differentiate between people who have high and low ambiguity. And we find that with people with ambiguity aversions, this belief distortion is going to become larger and is actually amplify the effect of ambiguity. So in the high ambiguity period, the belief distortions play a higher role for the economic forecast. Regarding the scaling effect, the scaling effect has a very mixed result in this case, because the scaling effect is have kind of hedging effect, in the sense when ambiguity is high, the scaling effect is also high, but when ambiguity is too high, the scaling effect going to become smaller. So the scaling effect has kind of equal role in all of them, I would think. And about the estimation method, if I understand correctly, you ask about increase the number of variables and use other type of estimations to do it, right? So the first part about increased number of variable. In my model is very simple. We can estimate like about 3 variables: GDP growth, consumption, and investment. In the paper, I only show GDP growth, but I have also tried with the consumption and investment. The mechanism also work quite well, but not as well as the GDP for investment, because they have the same mechanism that when ambiguity increase, the return of investment decrease, so people tend to invest smaller amount. However, for consumption is honestly, it doesn't work that well, because we don't really have the mechanism to have the consumption smoothing. So in my model, when ambiguity increase, the consumption will also increase, because people tend to prefer to consume now rather to consume in tomorrow. So this is not very matched with the data that the consumption should also decrease when uncertainty increase. About the other estimation technique that I have tried, I haven't tried the one that you mentioned, particle filter. So I don't know how would that affect the model. I've tried the Bayesian estimations and the maximum likelihood simulated method of moment. And the Bayesian estimation is the most standard one in macro. But at that time that I was trying Bayesian estimation, I used the dynamic, the standard model, and it's required model to be linearized. And when the model is linearized, is the nonlinear effect that caused by the belief distortion disappear. So that deteriorate the model performance. So especially during the crisis, that nonlinear effect is very important. So by linearize the model and solve the model using the standard method, that didn't work well comparing to the estimation method that I'm using now. Yes. I think I finished my...
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Iman van Lelyveld, who was also a member of the assessment committee and who is Professor of Banking and Financial Markets at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and at the Nederlandse Bank. The floor goes to Professor van Lelyveld.
Thank you very much. Dear candidates, let me also congratulate you on a well-executed thesis, and I'll come to my question in a minute. But first, I would also like to thank you for your time at DNB, where it was an absolute joy to host you. You, with your personal sort of bubbling personality, was a very happy sight to see at the department meetings. Now, on your thesis, you've taken on a very complicated topic with wide-ranging implications. So forecasting is difficult, especially with regard to the future, and you're aiming to disentangle forecasts errors into errors that we should be able to understand, right? Because they're forecastable, and the ones that we really don't know, they're unknowable. Quite a steep mountain to climb. So let me begin with a question about the very first step, and that takes you to table 2.4 on page 28, the first regression. Here we are looking at the effect of uncertainty on GDP growth expectations of professional forecasters, right? We see a negative sign of the current uncertainty and an almost universal positive sign of lagged uncertainty. You conclude that, and I quote, "This suggests that an increased growth in macroeconomic uncertainty depresses GDP forecasts." Now, I would like you to unpack this conclusion a little bit, and I have three or four questions/concerns. So the first is that you argued that there is no reverse causality, which I think I would agree with, but you put in contemporaneous uncertainty and yet speak about uncertainty affecting forecasts. So how does that work if it's at the same time it's still affecting? Then I would say there's a joint factor, but it's not an affecting factor. The second point or question I have is that you have negative signs, but are these effects big? Because a 1% increase indeed leads to 0.05 decrease in the one regression and a bigger one in the other, but are these like big movements or not? Then the third point is that the contemporaneous sign is negative, but the lagged sign is positive. Doesn't that sort of lead to maybe washing out the whole effect at all? And maybe that's not bad, maybe it's good, I don't know. Tell me. And those are the questions I had.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and the questions. So I would like to address the first question about reverse causality and the joint factor. I do agree that there are the joint factor. So the causality identification here is not very sophisticated. It's not up to the highest method. But if we talk about joint factor, in this case, I make use of the panel data sets, and then in the panel data sets, easily say would be that if everyone in the data sets move into the same directions at the same time with this macro uncertainty increase, so we can conclude that there might be some joint effect that from macro uncertainty to people react on average at the same thing. Like on average, they react on the same direction. And how is that become joint factor, or is really like the one direction from macro uncertainty to the people expectations? I did not disentangle that in this case, but if I would do that, we have to disentangle the joint factor that you say, and the really exogenous shocks from macro uncertainty. So the joint factor that we think might not be the uncertainty, so, and the exogenous shock that really come from the uncertainty. So if we can disentangle that, we might be able to see whether the effect hold. However, let me again point to the other research that I have extended from this one. So we also have another research using the same data sets, but with a better mechanism, better method to do that. We have used the daily data sets to see if today uncertainty, how it's affecting your forecast. And we do observe that it's still negative. So although it's not in here, I still believe that the negative effects hold, because in other paper that I am still studying on that, we observe the same effect. For the lag effect, it's positive, yes. And I think that is because the uncertainty itself is auto-regressive process. So the past uncertainty also have effect on the current uncertainty. And actually how I interpreted that the growth of uncertainty still have the negative effect on people. Because if you use the current lag, current time subtract by the past lag, in all of the case, we still have the negative sign. So the growth of uncertainties have negative effect. And about the sign, the magnitude, if it's big or not. In the period I have in my sample, for example, the US, at that time the US GDP growth, I think is about 2% average. The average GDP growth is 2%. So one of the results that's showing here is that 1% increase in uncertainty will reduce the economic growth by 0.5%, and that's almost 1/4 of the GDP, right? Yeah. So I think comparing to the current growth level that we have at that time in the US, 2%, and is reduced by 0.5%, I think it's considered to be a big one.
But isn't the question whether the 1% is a big move, right? Because it's whether the X moves a lot or not. So is 1% a lot of change in terms of uncertainty, volatility of uncertainty?
I have to look at the. So I don't know if the 1%
Good answers.
is usual.
I'm satisfied. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Tanja Treibig, who was the last member of the assessment committee, and she's associate professor in economics at this university. The floor goes to Dr. Treibig.
Thank you. Like the others, I would really like to congratulate Paan on a very interesting thesis and also very coherent. We really see the steps from the different chapters, one to the other, and how they all contribute to the very coherent questions you set up in the introduction, and also your ability to explain in very simple ways very complex problems. I would like to talk more about the aspect related to rationality or departure from rationality that you focus on in your thesis, and that's related more specifically to chapter 2, but also comes back in the rest of the thesis, of course. So, as I understand, what's important in your setup is that you have multiple scenarios. Mostly you discuss 2 different scenarios, and then there's a worst-case scenario and a normal scenario. And people might be optimist or pessimist in terms of how they weight the different scenarios, all right? So what's explaining a bit your fact that is a bit surprising with higher or reduced uncertainty in bad times is basically about the certainty about the worst case scenario by the households. And I would like you to consider how this relates to the more general literature on behavioral economics, behavioral biases, and in particular, how people asymmetrically respond to signals. So when they have positive signals or negative signals, and their response might be different. And maybe if you can relate this to what you discussed in the answer to Professor Sanders related to the policy implications for central bank communication. You had the example of the Brexit, where that was a very good example for your model because you have two known cases, the good scenario and the bad scenario, that are known in advance. It might not be always the case that you know which are the different scenarios, but in this case you do. And by providing all the information of what will happen in the bad scenario, they might also infuse feedback effects in terms of, oh, then this scenario becomes more relevant or highlighted even more, and this could have also kind of vicious effects. So when considering this central bank communication or government communication about the bad scenarios, how can they deal with this behavioral bias? And more in general, in your answer, how your findings relate to the behavioral economics literature. Thank you.
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and the questions. So I would like to answer the first questions about the link of the result in chapter 2 and the other literatures. So in chapter 2, we found that people have the negative bias to when uncertainty increase, and this negative bias, as far as I know, is not only observed in the economic literatures. Even with the same survey data set and with different variables, we still observe the negative bias, not just the GDP, the inflation as well. And in the other literature, like experimental literature, I recently read one. So in that literature, it shows that the negative bias is not just about you are facing uncertainty. It can happen every time. For example, one of the interesting examples that they show there is that the baby tends to express something negatively even they were born. So at that time, it's not about uncertainty or anything, it's about the survivability. So then compared to the positive bias, the baby, the infant, also express more negatively than positively. And in that case, I think it's quite natural to observe the effect that people have the negative bias, even in different level, not just about when we're facing with uncertainty. When we look at other literature like this one on a very basic level. So, and I think that's my answer to your question, that we have observed that.
If you could also answer on the implications for central bank communication.
Yeah, and the policy implication about communication. I really agree that the policy communication sometimes has the adverse effect. So sometimes Brexit might not be a bad outcome, but they have already communicated that Brexit is going to be the bad outcome. So I think for policymakers, that is very part that they have to be very careful with. So in the first case, I think that the policymaker shouldn't put a judgment on the strong ambiguity if they don't know it for sure. And then the way to communicate is to base on the data set as much as possible and communicate right away what they will do if this happens. So and try not to, and that I think that will not amplify the uncertainty, because the policy guideline or the forward guidance is quite clear that if this happens, I will do this. And I think that was the practice for most of the central bank, that they try to have the forward guideline and try to make people expect what they're gonna do, but not too harsh. So kind of like gradually make the people expectation move according to what they will do, and it will not like make the market become surprised or will reduce the adverse effect that might come indirectly from the policy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Johan Muysken. Professor Muysken is both an honorary and an emerite professor of economics at this university. The floor goes to Professor Muysken.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Poon, thank you very much for this very nice thesis. It's elegantly written on a very interesting and relevant subject, the impact of Knightian uncertainty, which you call ambiguity on macroeconomic behavior. You also had a very nice introduction where you started with the timeline, where you jumped from Knight to the RBC models in one big jump. Well, I happen to study between those two things. And in those two, between those 2 points, actually, uncertainty was introduced in macroeconomics by two very important persons. On the one hand, John Maynard Keynes, and on the other hand, Friedrich von Hayek. Both are very important in introducing this topic in macroeconomics, essentially. And from there, you had the post-Keynesian development on the one hand, where you had this non-market clearing, quantity adjustments, and short-run focuses. And on the other hand, you had the Austrian school, instigated by von Hayek, market clearing, price adjustment, and the long-run focus. And these RBC models, which you chose to use for your model, to my surprise, I must admit, they are typically in the Austrian tradition, essentially. And they kind of hijacked this, the answer to this question by introducing risk in the model. And you very rightly point out that by introducing risk, you, in a way, neutralize the question. And what you did not mention, and what you maybe not do fully realize, is that the Austrians would never accept the notion of a representative individual, which is essentially central to the real business cycle models. An important reason for uncertainty in the Austrian thinking is the interaction between individuals. And that causes, and at least enhances, macroeconomic uncertainty. And so there's a big feedback of what's going on in the economy towards macroeconomic uncertainty. And you already are seeing where I'm heading it to, because on the other hand, the post-Keynesians had this Minskian uncertainty, which is essentially the same process. Also, the individual behavior causes uncertainty, which enhances macroeconomic uncertainty. And this is where your rabbit is put in the hat, because all of a sudden in your model, macroeconomic uncertainty is exogenous. And this is something I would like to, first of all, point out very clearly, that this is putting a rabbit in the hat. And second of all, that I would like to ask you, what would you happen if you kind of start to show what would happen if there would be feedback? Because, of course, there is feedback. What you assume is that firms invest their savings into capital. Well, they don't. They simply spend it a lot on financial assets, which has nothing to do with investing in capital. Households invest their savings in capital. Forget it. They gamble on housing prices. They also buy financial assets, etc. So there's a lot going on, which is not exactly in this RBC world going on. But even if it would go on in this RBC world, how can you deny that there is a feedback from what is going on in this world to macroeconomic uncertainty? Well, I can go on for hours, but let me. I think I have asked an implicit question, but I would like you to comment on that. Yeah.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind word and very interesting questions. Yes, I agree that in my model, the macro uncertainty is treated as exogenous, and I didn't assume any feedback loop in the model. And if I would do the speculation myself, how would I incorporate the feedback loop into the model? So I think one of the important part that you have already mentioned, that in the model there's no financial sector. So, and in the literature
And that for a person who works at the central bank.
Not anymore, Dustin.
So in the literature, it's known that the financial sector is the part that amplify the shocks, and what we decide to do in the financial sector has the feedback loop to the shock. And if I would put the feedback loop in my model, I would put it on the financial sector. I would add the financial sector into the model to see if the uncertainty that is truly exogenous, how it will have the effect, and how it will amplify the truly exogenous uncertainty on the people expectations. And I think what will change in my model is that the role of uncertainty that I'm using now is going to be reduced, because the amplification of uncertainty is already is already partly going to be assigned to the financial sector that we have it now. Do I have time to? Yes, please. Yes. And second speculation that I would think is that we might be able to have a high and low ambiguity averse agent in one model, and the one agent that would be amplify the uncertainty is those with high ambiguity aversion, because they are the one who are afraid of ambiguity, and they will make, yeah. So I think that would allow the feedback loop in the model. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Stefan Straatmans, who is Professor of Finance at this university. The floor goes to Professor Straatmans.
Dear candidate, dear Poramapa, first of all, I would like to join all my predecessors here in praising the stuff you did. Given the demise of traditional micromodels during and after the global financial crisis, the importance of behavioral-inspired macromodels that explicitly acknowledge model uncertainty in the form of ambiguity aversion cannot be underestimated, I think, and is very topical and important. Moreover, I appreciate that you write in a very clear and a pleasant way in explaining the models at hand. But luckily, a few questions remain, and that's why we are here and why we have some scientific debate. And I would like to go with you to chapter 2, more specifically, where you try to measure the impact of macroeconomic uncertainty on income expectations, GDP growth expectations, and subjective uncertainty. And you distinguish between professional forecasters and households, respectively. Now, given that you try to explain in later chapters some of the puzzling chapter 2 regression outcomes by introducing ambiguity aversion, I was a bit triggered by, okay, what causes this level of ambiguity aversion? Because that is this parameter gamma, and you first calibrate it to certain values, and then you try to estimate it in chapter 4. But it still remains to me a little bit of a black box. And when I was reading your regression tables in chapter 2, you have there a couple of control variables that already seem to anticipate potential determinants of risk/ambiguity aversion. But maybe I'm wrong, so correct me if that is the case. And one of the set of control variables there are so-called personal characteristics. And then when I think of ambiguity aversion, I also think of risk aversion, a second parameter that you also have in your model. And there is, of course, a lot of research in behavioral economics, behavioral finance about, maybe not in behavioral macro, that I don't know, about the determinants of risk aversion. And we know that personal characteristics play there an important role, and there is a lot of heterogeneity across individuals. Things like, for example, males or females, so gender, but also age. But I didn't see that popping up in your personal characteristics. So could you maybe speculate a little bit on what might be the determinants of this gamma? Suppose that I would set up an analysis with gamma as a left-hand side variable of a regression.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and questions. If I would speculate, so for the ambiguity aversion, they have also studying about that male is more ambiguity averse than male, opposing to the risk aversion. So there are some study about personal characteristics that affect ambiguity aversion. But that's, of course, is not in my paper. But if I would speculate what would affect the ambiguity aversion, it would come from the graph in chapter 4. So I have one regression. I have one estimation, that rolling estimation about the change in ambiguity aversion versus risk aversion.
4.6, huh?
Graph.
Figure 4.6.
Yes, figure 4.6. So at that time, so this graph would be one of the explanation what changed ambiguity aversion, and the experience about the crisis and how people deal with that would be also the answer to this. Like the person that have been exposed to the crisis would have higher ambiguity aversion. And from that graph, we also have the estimation across 4 European countries and there are different MBD versions. And for example, one of them we find that the MBD version in Italy and in Spain is higher than the one in Germany and France. Table 4.5.
And is that also the case for the risk aversion?
The risk aversion as well.
So, because that is also what you see more or less in figure 4.6, that there seems to be a positive correlation between the two time series,
Yeah.
which might suggest that actually the same triggers play for both parameters.
I wouldn't say it always. It might be positive, the same trigger, but in figure 4.6, in the dot-com crisis, uncertainty didn't increase. So there are certain different characteristics between dot-com crisis and global financial crisis that trigger the increase in ambiguity aversion. So even though I didn't really delve into what characteristic it is that's driving these two different. If I would have speculated again to guess that the nature of dot-com crisis is much more about risky, it's the stock price bubble and stock price collapse. But for the global financial crisis, it seems to be different because the collapse of Lehman Brothers is much more ambiguous at the starting point than risky. So I think that in that case, that's why it's trigger the ambiguity aversion in 2008 rather than in the dot-com crisis.
Okay.
Thank you. This concludes the first round and gives us an opportunity to enter into a second round. Shortly though, we've got a few minutes left, and it's a custom at this university to give those opponents who come from further away the floor first. That means that Dr. Damian Pfeiffer will get another opportunity to discuss with you an issue which he thinks is important with regards to your thesis. Dr. Pfeiffer.
Thank you, Prorector. My second question was also very much in line with the questions that were asked before already regarding the policy implications, and especially because I'm coming from a central bank, policy implications for communication and for monetary policy strategies are of utmost importance here. And you already alluded that in this case, like it was done by the Bank of England in the case of Brexit, it's important to show or to start communicating, for example, different possibilities of outcomes and how the central banks would react in these different outcomes. But also more generally, the central banks are nowadays communicating much more, communicating also uncertainty, like with their fund charts, with their dot plots in the case of the Federal Reserve. And this all has implications for the question that you address in your thesis. And in this last minute or two that you have, perhaps we can discuss a little bit more about this, if that is okay with you, and you can potentially discuss any other potential ways how the central banks could improve their communication practices by taking into account that one of their objectives could be reducing ambiguity as well.
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your questions. So if I would summarize correctly, that you asked from my model how the central bank can improve their communications, give from the research I learned. Right. One of the answers that I have answered before that about the distinguish between risk and ambiguity and communicating about that and plan the policy differently between risk and ambiguity would also be beneficial. Another part that I would think about is the transparency of the central bank. I think that transparency of the central bank is very different across the world, and for example, bank.
Please feel free to briefly conclude your response.
Yes. for example, Bank of Korea, they have the press release about who vote about who, which is not every central bank do that. Well, sometimes when they announce the policy, they only say 1 against 2 or 2 against 2, something like that. So I think being transparent about your policy announcement and the press release or anything in the policy will help reduce the uncertainty in the economy, because some people do read the press communication and read the meeting minutes of the central bank, and I think we can be more transparent in that published data set.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Poramapa Poonpakdee, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. What's on the line? I know can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Poramapa Poonpakdee, the degree committee here present, has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. And Professor Cole is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch University custom. And I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority invested in us by law and in conformity with the decisions of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Poramapa Poonpakdee, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
The oratio following this wonderful deserved gift to you will be done by Dr. Piccolo.
Dear Dr. Poonpakdee, dear Pon, congratulations on this important milestone. It is a true pleasure to give you this speech on your special day. Seeing your printed book brought me back to the memorable journey you completed in these few years. A journey which took place across the continents and through unprecedented global events, marked by your world-class analytical skills and willpower, your creative drive, and your unyielding curiosity to know and to understand. Walk back with me along the path you took and to the enduring legacy of your years here in Maastricht. It all started with a PhD vacancy. This was one not very different than many others, on the field of uncertainty in macro, data and theory, policy outlook. Cool text, some blah blah. What was clear from the beginning, though, was that you were not just another applicant. By the time we planned the online interview, we had exchanged a remarkable series of emails and entertained a number of interesting written conversations on potential PhD paths. In each one, you would take as a starting point the most recent messages, and you would move definitely ahead with structured arguments which led the conversation forward, making questions explicit in your thinking, and posing hypotheses in regards to how to approach the problem next. What impressed me at that stage, and it still does through the years, was your ability to take my feedback, bring it back squarely to your argument, and come up with a new, original, and insightful synthesis. Your drive to understand the world, your curiosity to learn the answer when nobody knew the way forward, your fearless search for truth. That was and is all that mattered. And that drive, I recognize it every time we meet. That synthesis, it is a discovery, a new, original and raw truth that was previously hidden, only to be made self-evident by your hard work. In fact, it was not a month ago that while bouncing ideas back and forth over some dark chocolate, of course, we made the most recent discovery, this time at the frontier of research, about your model of individual learning under uncertainty that replicates a lot more stylized facts and more fundamental than we initially realized. But then, this is just but the last discovery. In the beginning, we had reading groups of papers, chapters, and entire books. You remember the book titled Robustness by Hansen and Sargent? We never really thought it was that robust at all. We also had practical tasks, like the project Scrape, where we studied social media communication in the province of Limburg. Then, just as you were beginning to form your international network in Europe and worldwide, came the period of lockdowns and Corona. We closed ourselves into Zoom meetings with white walls behind us and silent rooms. And even that did not discourage you. You attended online conferences, mastered teaching in breakout rooms, and before long, you were organizing Gathertown events. In this time, you dwelled deeper into the conceptual, more profound meaning of your own research and of your empirical findings, as well as your arising new model. What mechanisms exactly are at work when people face uncertainty? And why might they lead people astray, causing actually stronger opinions, maybe polarization, and ultimately, through more extreme beliefs, deeper recessions? The questions you asked then were timely. They were also timeless. The answers you found, well, they're in your book. The process, that was the best part. Day-long meetings and new discussions shortly after those, but with miles of progress in between. Your strong mathematical mindset, your logical intuition, and your relentless problem-solving drive are a recipe for success. The thesis moved from stylized facts to a model to actual economic forecasts. Forecasts that are really impressive, as I have personally heard several colleagues mention to me at international conferences, referring to your work after they attended your presentations. Finally, PON. This past year, we co-organized a successful conference track in Maastricht. We had a road trip to Germany with a car full of friends and colleagues. When we traveled to France, where in a single evening, I remember conversations on ambiguity smoothing models, derivatives of logarithms, and Justin Bieber. As you embark on the next chapters of your life, I do hope you bring some of this experience with you. And above all, I am sure that this is just the beginning. Congratulations, Dr. Poonpakdee, and good luck in all you will choose to do next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Dr. Poonpakdee, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family and friends, and your supervisors with the degree you have acquired. And I would like to thank the members of the degree committee for their valuable contribution. And I would like to give Dr. Pfeiffer, who was online, to also give you an opportunity to congratulate you.
Dear Dr. Poonpakdee, this was really an impressive set of papers, and I wish to congratulate you on the degree of doctor. Well deserved, and please continue working on the topic in the future as well. You will be very successful.
Thank you. With this, I close this session.
Thank you very much.
So we can take a picture here with Dr. Van Vaan in the background, and then we'll take a picture later on the larger stage.
Recording stopped.